And feel pleased to be invited to chair this panel in Wenzao University. And our panel, the title of our panel is called International Institution in Southeast Asia. And we have two presenters and one or two discussants. And allow me to introduce all of us first. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm the moderator for this panel, and I am from National University, and my institute is called Institute of Political Science, and I'm currently taught some IR course there as an associate professor. So that's me, and let me introduce two presenters first. The first presenter is Sanjay Holden, and he's from National Chengkong University. Are you master's students or the master's students? And he's going to present the papers co-authored with Dr. Wenzao. And the title of the paper is called Multilateral Development Banks and the Political Alignment of ASEAN States, a comparative analysis of voting structures and capital subscriptions in the AIIB and ADB. And our second presenter is Ariel Blackney. Actually, I'm his advisor for the PhD program. It's a lot of coincidence, right?
Yeah.
And he's going to present a paper co-authored with Olivia Yang. And the title of their paper is called Quantifying Aggressive Discourse in International Conflict, the South China Sea. And I'm the discussant for the first paper, Sanjay Holden's paper, and for the second paper, we have our very honorable discussant, Dr. Himawan Bayu Patriadi, and he's currently the director of Center for Research in Social Science and Humanity of the University of Jamber in Indonesia, and I just learned that he's also a adjacent research fellows in Wenzao University. So I hope we have a very fruitful discussions in this topic. And let me specify the rule of this panel. So each presenter will have up to 18 minutes for presentations. And I think probably we can have our discussions about like 10 minutes. And then after the presenter finishes presentations, and we'll follow by each discussant. And then after all the presentations and discussants, then we will open our discussion to the floor, and you are very welcome to ask questions or have comments to our presenters. So, okay, are we agree on this? So, okay, so let's start with our first presenter. So, Sanjay Holden, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Sanjay Holden from National Chengkong University, and the topic of my research is multilateral development banks and the political alignment of ASEAN states. The comparative analysis of the voting structures and capital subscription allocation between the ADB and the AI. So Southeast Asia is regarded as an important battleground of US-China rivalry, and that holds true in the space of multilateral development banks in the face of a widening infrastructure investment gap, which sits at about 26 trillion from 2016 to 2030, according to a 2017 ADB report. So an important source of dissatisfaction in traditional MDBs, such as the World Bank and the ADB, is about representation power, or at least is one of the angles from which China is facing its criticisms. And research is mainly focused on how the level of participation and representation relates to the positioning of ASEAN states. And as explored by several scholars, the strategies of Southeast Asian states don't fall exactly in the categories of balancing or bandwagon. Governments are pursued hedging strategies between China and the United States. And the positioning of each nation is slightly different from one another, and in this research I wanted to investigate how that different reflects in their behavior in multilateral development banks. So the questions I wanted to answer are: how do the voting structures of the three MDBs differ from one another? How has the participation behavior changed over the 5-year time frame after the AIIB was established in And finally, how the political and economic alignment between US and China influence the participation behavior of ASEAN states between the AIIB and ADB. And the hypothesis is that the participation behavior of ASEAN states in these institutions would align with their political and economic position between the United States and China. So this is literature review. So an important theme of this research is the positioning of ASEAN states, and due to the high level of ambiguity and fluidity in the relations between these states, there isn't a standard answer. However, several scholars have provided insights on this issue. And the first is David Shamo's spectrum of relations, in which he places 10 states on the spectrum. We have Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines on the left, leaning towards the United States, and the remaining 7 leaning towards China. New York Times also provided an assessment based on a panel of experts with similar results. And finally, TSE inputs analyze which nations have always support or condemned China's Xinjiang and Hong Kong policies. Myanmar, PDR, and Cambodia supported both. So the 3 sets presented in this research are based on the triangulation between these accounts. And regarding the calculation of voting power, Strand attempted to calculate the relative voting structure of the ADB. However, the indexes, such as the Johnson, Wenzao, and Shapley index, seem to focus internally on the decision-making process without much emphasis on other factors such as the GDP shares and how much power states would expect. So the voting share to GDP was used in Professor Chen's article to test the validity of the argument that states were underrepresented. And strong evidence is provided that the AIIB did not really address the issue of underrepresentation. The ratio will also be an important indicator in this research, and the little difference I made in this research is that it is only concerned with the share of global GDP instead of the GDP share within the institution, because Japan and the United States account for approximately 1/3 of the world's GDP, and they are both absent of the AIIB. So the research is qualitative in nature. It explores both directions of the relationship between states and the 2 MDBs, since they are all members of both. Participation is measured by the amount of capital subscription, and that reflects through the voting structure, resulting in a certain voting power distribution. So the political alignment is analyzed in 3 steps based on the triangulation of the accounts mentioned earlier. The first set is aligned towards the United States. The second set is relatively neutral, and the third set is closer to China. And the independent variable are political positioning, trade dependency, and FDI. The dependent variable are the distribution of capital subscription and voting power to GDP ratio. Institutional documents are the main source of data. So the first part of the analysis focuses on fundamental voting structures of these 3 DBs. So they are compared in the first stage. We have the equally distributed basic votes and the share votes that depend on capital subscription. Most MDBs follow this voting scheme. Now the AIIB has an additional founding member votes, which amounts to about 3% of the votes. Based on the voting structure above, it could be argued that the ADB is the most inclusive since it has the most basic votes, especially for smaller economies. Now next, I calculated the capital subscription percentage and the voting power to GDP ratio in each state, divided by 3 groups. And this is the first group, aligned towards the US. Now Vietnam is the only nation that is better represented in the AIIB. It also has a higher capital subscription amount in the China Mint institution, as will be illustrated later. And next, in the relatively neutral group of states, Thailand, Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia, only Thailand is better represented in the AIIB. However, the gap has narrowed in 2021 Malaysia's voting power to GDP capital subscription is quite low for the size of its economy. Finally, in the states more closely aligned towards China, PDR and Cambodia were better represented in the AIIB in 2016. However, by 2021, all three nations were better represented in the ADB. And when we look at them in sets, the differences between the two institutions is quite clear. In 2016, in the third set, consisting of Myanmar, Laos, PDR, and Cambodia, were all better represented in the AIIB. However, by 2021, all sets were better represented in the ADB. Surprisingly, in the second group, which is the neutral group, it has the lowest capital subscription percentage in all the groups. The highest group is the first group, aligned towards the US, and the lowest is the third group, which is aligned towards China. Now this table illustrates the individual capital subscription amount of each state, and the percentage here represents the percentage of each state total capital subscription in both institutions. When we look at a total amount, Vietnam and Laos PPR are the only two nations that have a higher capital subscription than the AIIB. Malaysia's capital subscription is in the AIIB is extremely low for the size of its economy. Over 95% is allocated towards the ADB. Now this graph demonstrates the change in voting power to GDP ratio between 2016 to 2021. What stands out is the sharp decline in the two sets and the ranking. In the ADB, the second set is the best represented, followed by the third and the first. In the AIIB, the third set is the best represented. The first, aligned to the US, has the lowest voting power to GDP ratio. It appears here that the figures have increased in 2021. However, this is due to the inclusion of the Philippines into the voting calculation. So we exclude that factor. It appears that the AIIB isn't set to overtake the ADB. And as the number of participants increase, both votes are diluted. Now when we look at the trade dependency and the capital subscription, it appears that the nations that have traded more with China aren't necessarily active participants of the AIIB. However, an inbound FDI percentage in each set is deeply reflected of its political alignment. Whereas the differences in capital subscription between each state is small, although each state's capital subscription in the ADB far exceeds that of the AIIB. So based on this analysis, it appears that initially, the AIIB could afford to allocate more votes to its members, mostly due to the exclusion of the United States and Japan. 4 out of 10 ASEAN states were better represented in the AIIB in 2016. By 2021, however, Vietnam and Thailand were the only 2 out of the 10 states that were better represented in the AIIB by a rather insignificant margin. And as for the participation behavior, only Vietnam and Laos PDR have allocated more capital towards the AIIB out of the 10 nations. Regarding the original hypothesis that institutional participation would align with political alignment, only Singapore, the Philippines, and Laos PDR have displayed such a phenomenon, whereas Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia did not. Nations that have traded goods significantly more with China are not necessarily more active participants of the AIIB. Now, given that the capital subscription to the AIIB remains almost identical among Set 1 and Set 3, the figures hint that the AIIB has functioned as an equalizer and a supplementary source of infrastructure investment that mediates the inbounding FDI gap in ASEAN nations, the United States and China. the implications. So key indicators suggest that ASEAN states are generally more invested in the ADB. It may lack the incentive to shift its balance for stronger representation due to how the voting power of both institutions are calculated, even if the factor of capital subscription is excluded. Furthermore, factors such as the growing domestic wariness of China's political influence paired with each state's established relationship with the ADB could present obstacles to the expansion of AIB. Now, foreign direct investment is highly consistent with the political alignment. It appears that the participation behavior did not entirely align with the political alignment, as it observed in Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia. And for Vietnam, the AIB provides much needed funding. However, due to its disputes in the South China Sea and the oil crisis in 2016, there's a general wariness on China's political agenda, okay, and the influence embedded in its infrastructure investment projects. And although the positioning of the states are fluid, it could be observed that in Malaysia during the Mahathir administration, and the Philippines pivot toward China, which turned out to be temporary. A general undercurrent of wariness exists, and positioning, posing a challenge for China-led institutions and initiatives, despite the need for capital. So investigating this disparity between the strategies implemented by each state might be proven important. So that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Sanji Holden for the very interesting paper and presentations. So I'll jump in for first paper. And as a discussant or as a author that writes a lot on the AIB, I'm very happy to see some of my paper is cited in, in your paper. And I truly hope that this research can be published one day, so you know I can have more citations. Yeah, that's the first things I want to mention. So as I go to publish this paper, I think there's something that can be better. So below I'm going to discuss the problem I saw, and please don't take that as a harsh criticism, but as probably some problem that I saw that you can improve the quality of your paper. So the first things I saw is about sorry. So can I change the rule as a chair? Okay, right? Okay. So the first thing is about the literature. I saw this paper is mainly about the voting structure and voting, not voting behavior, the vote structure of the multilateral banks, right, development banks. So I think the most important thing is, you know, on this issue, on this matter. So as a reader, I hope to see more citations that is about, you know, the ADB, research on ADB or research on AIB or the World Bank. And actually, in fact, there's a lot of political economic analysis about which country receive more funds, more investment from the multilateral development bank and which does not. And there's many political and economic implications that can help you probably to form more testable hypothesis. So I would encourage you to add those kind of literature more, because so far I saw the literature you cite on mostly about the independent variable, about the geopolitical situations facing the Southeast Asian countries, but I don't think that's the main things. So as a researcher, I think the dependent variable and the outcome you're trying to explain should be the key things. So every material you use, you cite should focus on this one rather than the other way around. this is about the literature issues. And the second thing is about the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is Southeast Asian countries voting, the voting power, and the share of the voting power, and see if this is influenced by their geopolitical and probably some economic relationship with China. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm right? So about the dependent variable, there are two things I want to raise. The first thing is that since this is about the Southeast Asian countries' participatory behavior in the multilateral development banks, so I think the proxy you use should be something that is more about these dimensions rather than just how much voting power a Southeast Asian country has. Probably you can see that a country's voting power in the multilateral development bank probably cannot reflect the current situations facing each countries, because you can see either in IMF or World Bank or ADB or even AIIB, the voting power distribution is very, very, very hard to change. So it can better reflect the initial situations facing each Southeast Asian country when they initially joined the ADB, but it might not reflect the current situation they're confronting. For example, like in the ADB case, I think most of the Southeast Asian countries joined the ADB in 1966, and the voting power they got back then may pretty much highly correlated with the voting power they have right now. So probably if you're trying to say that the current ADB voting distributions among Southeast Asian countries, it can probably reflect better to the Cold War area rather than probably in the contemporary days. And I think the situation is the same in the AIIB. You can see, compare with their voting structure in 2021 and 2016 are pretty much the same. Pretty much there's nothing changed. But as you see that, as you mentioned in this paper, that Southeast Asian countries' geopolitical situation are not fixed, right? They're fluid. And many things have changed since the last probably 5 or 6 years. And after the China and United States start to engage severe strategic competition, a lot of things have changed. So if the voting structure is fixed and the geopolitical situation is changed, so how can these independent variable and this dependent variable explain each other? Right? You are using a fixed thing trying to explain the changed voting structure. So it probably does not make too much sense to me. So I would say that the main problem of the dependent variable is that the proxy you use, probably voting structure or voting power, is not an ideal indicator for a dependent variable. So I would suggest that for most of the multilateral development bank research, especially those involved geopolitical analysis, the most dependent variable they use to capturing a country's behavior is how much loan they receive in a given year. And to me, that makes more sense because it's behavior, right? A state's behavior. So that means, if you measure a state's loan received in a certain year, it means that in the previous year or previous 2 years, this country have been actively applied for the loan from ADB, AIIB, or the World Bank. That shows more instant behavior, immediate behavior in the year that you're trying to analysis. So I would suggest probably using the loan receipt is a more reasonable proxy to capturing Southeast Asian countries' dynamic behavior. And you can see that each year in the amounts they receive. I would say that probably is changed, based on its own situation. So probably after 2015, some countries are align closer to China, and they're trying to apply less from World Bank or ADB and apply more loans from the AIB. So that may more, to me, is more reasonable indicator as a dependent variable. And the second thing about the dependent variable is you measure a lot of share, relative percentage. For example, like for all the money you subscribe, subscribe the share from ADB and AIB, and how much share you subscribe from ADB, and how much share the country subscribe from the AIB. And this is kind of relative measurement, right? But relative measurement implies that you think these countries are choosing side, as a given, given the amount of resources, I want to allocate, for example, like 20% on the AIB and 8% on the ADB, and then that probably might indicate that these countries are leaning closer to the ADB and the big player in ADB, the US and Japan, right? But as you mentioned in the last for the implication that almost all countries have invested more in ADB rather than IB. And that's because ADB have been established for decades. And if you see the total loan the ADB issue as several times, I think it's, I don't remember the exact figure, but I think it's like 8 or 9 times larger than the total loans issues by AIB. So the scale is different, so their participation is reasonably very different. So, and you also mentioned in your paper that AIB should be considered as a complementary institutions to the infrastructure investment in Asia rather than a competitor to the ADB. So if you agree with that, so probably you shouldn't use the relative indicator to capture like which sites are choosing. So according to my own understanding, the Southeast Asian country and probably all the development country in Asia, they are not choosing sites, between ADB and AIB. And I think ADB and AIB are not asking those countries to choose sites. If you want to apply loans in AIB, you cannot apply loans to the ADB. So probably to me, I think you can just measure the total amount rather than the share, since all the development countries are welcome or funds from either ADB or AIB. So that's my comments on the dependent variable for your reference. And also the third issue is about the independent variable. And I would like to see more of your own interpretations on the independent variable. So far, you just choose, you identify 3 countries, Philippines, Singapore, and the other, I forgot which one, that are lying closer to the US, right? And you didn't provide your own measurement, but instead you use a certain scholar's research, and then you just follow their interpretation to say, okay, these are countries are lying closer to China. But as a author, probably you should, it's fine if you want to borrow a certain research, but you also need to discuss the reasons and how they measured the Southeast Asian's geopolitical situations. And that would make more sense to me. Or I would say that I don't understand why these 3 countries are chosen as, countries are aligned closest to China. So that's the first problem. I think you should have your own measurements, and it's okay to borrow from other research, but it is not appropriate to just say, these authors says these countries are like closer to China, so I just take it for granted. So I don't think that's the appropriate way to see this. And also the other problem is that you mentioned that the geopolitical situation confronting Southeast Asian countries are not fixed, right? They're fluid. So how do your indicator seems to be a fixed one, right? From 2015 or 16 to 2021. in your analysis, geopolitical situations are the same. Those three countries